Hi, my name's Jon Galloway, and I'm a PM on the .NET community team at Microsoft. And today I'm going to be talking to you about simplifying microservices development with Tye. And an important word in here is the word development, because that's really an area where I'm going to focus on is the actual getting started and the development experience. So let's see. So first of all, in order to dig into that, let's talk about what do we even mean by microservices. And so this whole idea, as we were just starting to talk about there, was moving from a monolithic deployment to a microservice deployment where we're splitting things up. And when we do that, we're moving our thinking from the past where we would say our application is one group of tightly coupled components, and we put them all, each time we deploy, we put that all on a separate server. And early on in my development career, I remember these long conversations about, hey, we're going to upgrade our servers, and it took us months to spec out the right server because we only got one shot to upgrade that server. And these long, painful deployments. So with a microservice, we're able to break that up into separate components that can all be deployed separately. And that gives us a lot of flexibility in how we build and deploy our applications. And this really is facilitated and made possible by the use of containers. And so the idea of a container is an evolution from a virtual machine. So if you think about a virtual machine, it definitely gives you some flexibility, but it's also kind of heavy. And the reason is because each virtual machine is a whole machine. It includes the operating system. I like to think of when you're creating a virtual machine with Windows, each virtual machine has its own copy of Notepad and calculator and, all the video drivers and everything, right? So when you think about deploying your application virtually, you don't need all that. So what you really want is just the binaries and libraries that you depend on for your application. And then you want the operating system virtualized, right? So you want to virtualize your apps, but not your entire operating system itself. So when we think about moving away from a VM-based architecture to a containerized architecture, that gives us a lot of flexibility. We're able to, so if we look in this example here, we've got an application that's running on 2 VMs. And we have one VM that's busy and one that's not, and we're not really making the best IT use of this environment. So instead, if we look at that and we split that into containers, the container is very lightweight, very easy to deploy, and then we can move those containers around between different environments, different hosts. And in this case, you can see we're able to consolidate them onto one VM, one host, and then we actually can shut down this virtual machine. So in this case, we're able to see how we can make better IT use. We can take better use of our hosting technology. So that is what microservices are and kind of how it evolved from an IT perspective. But I want to talk to you more about why we care about it from a development perspective. And the real impact here is agility. Because what we really want to be able to do is, instead of waiting for one big deployment where we say, okay, everything works together, everything's all set, now we deploy it, and if you don't get your changes in for this big deployment, you're just stuck. In this case, we can say, all right, we're ready to deploy this small tested update for this one service or this one website, and we can push that out as soon as we're ready to do it. We can also ship our fixes and minor features in between. We can, and here's where we start kind of shifting our thinking. It's not just about the software we write, but it's actually the teams that are developing that. And so we can let teams focus and teams do what they're best at. And so really then you start thinking about teams as a business capability. And this is something where recently I went on site, and we talked to some developers that were using .NET and using Visual Studio for Mac and Visual Studio Code and Visual Studio Windows, and they're all developing things that all kind of work together, but actually when they were able to split them out, and one team said, we handle just the mapping and services component. And so they actually split that out into a separate service. And then another team was like, we work on the front end website. And so they told us that by splitting things out into a microservice-based architecture, it really simplified development, and it simplified the ability for them to plan and focus on doing just one thing. So there's .NET Conf series of conferences, and .NET Conf does a focus event. And there was one, I believe, is in August, and it was focused on microservices. And there was a keynote by Brendan Burns, who you may know of from Kubernetes, which is something we'll be talking about here. But Brendan Burns discussed this in more depth, and he said, you know, it's really about scaling teams. And so when you think about developing with microservices and scaling teams, really then you're focusing instead of one huge application that has everything in it, and instead you're able to focus on a very small bit and solve one small problem in one team. So, you know, really this comes down to empowering teams and individuals. What's really great with this is this really works at a more ideal developer group size. So if you've ever worked in a huge development team, there's all kinds of problems, even simple things like a stand-up takes an hour long because everyone's talking about things that have nothing to do with everyone else. And what you really want is this whole, they talk about a 1 or 2 pizza size team, you know, where 1 or 2 pizzas can feed the entire team. And that's great for a lot of reasons. Just a few being that, you know, somebody new to the team can understand the code quickly and get started quickly. You can keep the code all in your head as you're developing instead of trying to think about all these different things. You can focus on, my application does one thing. It keeps a list of the products and it returns them in JSON format, and that's all I need to worry about. So you can fit the code in your head. You can plan and think about things, but also thinking about developers and how they interact with their team. It's really important to think about what is their story for how they can be effective and impactful as a new developer on the team. So if I am a new developer on a huge product, I feel scared to break anything. I feel scared to raise my hand and say, hey, why don't we do this? Because my code will probably break something or have an interaction with something else. And I'll let the people who have been here for a long time talk. Well, if I'm working on one small thing that I can really fit in my head and I can draw the diagram for it on one piece of paper, then I feel pretty confident to say, hey, I understand this, or hey, you're going out on vacation, don't worry, I got it, you know? And so this really provides a way for new developers to a product or service to very quickly become contributing members of the team. All right. So microservices are amazing. They're great. Go use them. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk, and we're done. Except microservices also bring some problems. So we just talked about why you want to use microservices, and they're great. But as you start developing with microservices, you need to do some things. So in order to containerize and deploy things, then you start having to worry about how do you actually host, how do you create them, how do you put them all together. So when you're creating a new microservice, there's a lot of new technology and a lot of new things to learn. There's also, along with this, a lot of decisions you have to make. So you have to say, okay, are we using Kubernetes or Docker Swarm? And if we're, you know, which of these 9,000 different libraries are we using? And, you know, who handles this, and et cetera. There's just a lot of decisions you have to make. And unfortunately, a lot of them you have to make early in your development process. There's also a ton of YAML code, which is super fun. So let's talk about, we're setting up a new project. And first of all, I need to go out and I need to read the docs. I need to become an expert kind of in Docker. I need to understand what is, you know, what do I need to install? what is Docker Swarm and DockerCompose and Docker this and Docker that, and how do these, I need to actually learn a lot of stuff. Then if you're like me, when you started with Docker, then you started writing and breaking your Docker files. And Docker files are not huge, but it's another thing you've got to learn. And then as you evolve with this, okay, great, I've got a Docker file for my application, and I've got another Docker file for my backend service. And let's just keep it simple for then. We've got a front end and a back end. So great. Now I need to actually deploy them, and then I need to worry about scaling them. So Docker gives you, Docker makes it easy to build these containers that do that. But then I need to start using some other kind of infrastructure to handle that. So a very kind of popular one, the one that's sort of won out now, is Kubernetes. And Kubernetes is great, but it's more complicated. It's there's a lot going on. So you've got all these different nodes, you've got this control plane, you've got interaction with cloud hosting. There's kubectl for command line stuff. There's also a good amount of YAML. There's so much YAML. So, and that's fine. You know, YAML is a way of kind of declaratively saying what you want to do. But there's a lot of it. And you really, then you're writing and debugging YAML and making sure your indents are right and all these sorts of things. And so it is a lot to get started. Then, even once you've got your YAML, you've got your Kubernetes, then you start worrying about things like, okay, I've got Docker files, and could I create Kubernetes files from my Docker files? Because they're both YAML, and, you know, can't we work together? And sure, there's tools like Compose, and there are others out there, but so it's another thing to learn, more docs to read. Then you've got things like local development, where you've got to do things like when I update one file, I update one line in my website, and I would like to see it running in my development environment. Now I need to watch that file somehow. I need to restart things. So then people use things like scaffold. And then my application's not working. And then you go down this rabbit hole of all these other Kubernetes things like Zipkin. So I can do, you know, I can handle my tracing. And then I need to log stuff, and I need Seek, and then I've got all these things like Zipkin and Seek and all this stuff. And so I guess I'll use a package manager, because everyone needs another package manager. And so now we've got Helm. So the main point is, you don't need to know all this stuff to get started. It is a thing that kind of makes your head explode. What if instead we could do file new microservices, get started, and then turn on the complexity as we need it, instead of blowing our heads up at the very beginning? So that's really what this is focused on. So Project Tye simplifies the getting started experience, the local development experience, so what we call the inner loop. So I fix a bug, I test it locally, I check it in, I go on and get the next bug, I do the next feature request. So I'm doing my inner loop development. So that's really a sweet spot for Project Tye. Now, Project Tye is not primarily focused or built for deployment, and it can handle deployment, but really that's something we think that you're probably going to have your own special needs for how you want to deploy things, and that's just fine. You know, we want you to be able to take advantage of your local hosting infrastructure, or maybe your cloud hosting infrastructure, or your, you know, what your DevOps process is, et cetera. So really, an interesting thing here is the way Project Tye developed was members of the .NET team, David Fowler, Ryan Brandenburg, other people saying, hey, let's build some microservices and test it out. And when they did that, they're like, wow, I've got to learn a lot of things. I've got to configure it correctly. I've got to become an expert in a lot of things just to get started. And so they went through and developed some things that if you're building mostly .NET applications, .NET Core applications, then we will make it easy for you to just get started. So that's really the idea, is simplifying your developer inner loop. So the idea is we can kind of get you started with all these things using Project Tye. The important thing is we don't get rid of all those things. It's running on top of all that stuff. So One of the talks I really liked recently at .NET Conf in September was from Jon Gallant. Jon Gallant and I have worked together on teams before. We also have very similar names. It's Jon and his is Gallant and I'm Galloway. So we get each other's email a lot. But he gave a great talk where he talked about, it was something where it wasn't actually, hey, it's all about Project Tye. It was something where it was about simplifying, going from secretless development. But really, a lot of what he showed off was Project Tye. And I really liked how he showed simplifying things using Project Tye. So instead of learning how to create Docker files, you can just do Tye run. Instead of learning how to do Tye, start your services, you can do Tye run, and you can also create your own Tye YAML file. You can easily debug. So often debugging microservices can be really difficult. You've got to actually attach to processes that are running in a container, and that's not easy to do. And so this makes it completely trivial. Also, watching your changes as you go. So as you're changing your files, you don't want to, rather than having to use special things like scaffold, again, just to get started, you can just do Tye run watch. And I'll run through all this stuff in a second here, and you'll see it in action. And then again, instead of having to learn how to write Kubernetes files by hand or use another tool like Compose, you can actually just generate your Kubernetes files and then modify them, right? And then actually deploying. So you can test deploying. You can deploy locally on your machine, or you can deploy, out to a production environment. You can do that using Tye. And again, that's not really the main focus, but it is nice to be able to test out a deployment using something like Tye deploy. All right, so let's dig into some demos. First of all, I want to show you something, which is I have gone through and there's two ways that you can do this demo. And I want to show you actually a bit of a cheat sheet. I am on the Tye website. So it's github.net/Tye. I was actually in the dark theme this morning and I realized it's not the best for presenting, so I switched over to light theme, but it's nice to have an official dark theme on GitHub now. Okay, so out on Project Tye, this is the homepage of their site, and they've got this documentation. And as far as projects on GitHub go, they have some of the best documentation, I think, that's out there. So I'm intentionally going to be showing you several things that are very close to their documentation so that later you can go through and hopefully the things I show you will make a lot of sense and you can do your own Project Tye development locally. So I'm going to be showing you some things based on this. And the first thing, just the getting started experience. So you'll need to install Project Tye locally. It's a global tool. Now, there's the easy way and the hard way. I always do things the hard way, which is not a great quality, but I do. So here's the easy way. You do .NET tool install and then Project Tye. I'm actually running the local versions or the CI builds because I want to show you a new feature at the end of my demo. But so this is very simple to do. So here, if I do Tye, so there we go. And I think I could do Tye version. Right. So it's just a global tool. So what's neat with that is there's not a bunch of stuff you've got to do in order to get ready or to get started building. So I've actually got an empty folder on my desktop. So, oops. Okay, so I'm going to create a front end and a back end. And I'm going to do them quickly in the command line just to show you how simple it is, and then we'll switch over to Visual Studio. So if you are, hopefully this makes sense to everybody. If you're more of a command line person, I'll show you that. And then if you're a Visual Studio person, you'll see the exact same thing in Visual Studio, right? So empty directory. So I'll say .NET. Hopefully this is readable. And okay, so we'll do .NET new web app, and we'll do front end. Oops, that's not good. Well, now it's front end. That's fine. Then we'll do .NET new web API, and we'll call that backend. And just to keep with it, it's backend. And so now that's a front end and a back end. And then and this, this is a pretty common getting started thing where you've got a web app talking to backend API services. And then the final thing to kind of tie these together is we'll do we'll create a solution. New solution. Yep, great. So now we've got those things. And I'm going to add the two existing projects to the solution. So I'll say .NET solution add front end. Great. Okay. So these I've done nothing with Project Tye. I've got Project Tye tools installed as a global tool. I've created .NET new projects, and then I'll just do Tye run. How could this ever work? Well, it works because Project Tye understands solution files, CSproj files, and so it knows about these different things, right? So it's able to actually go and look at my solution. It discovers the projects, builds those projects, and then it says, whoa, something is actually running. So it's built these out. Now, this is a really key thing here. It's built out a dashboard for me. Whoop, I should not have done that. Let's run it again. We want to look at 127.001.8000. Oh, okay. Let's go over here. Okay. And here we've got a dashboard. This is really cool, actually. I've talked to teams and they're like, I'm running this thing in a console. I'm running this in VS Code. I'm over here in Visual Studio. I've got 9,000 different console windows open. I can't remember which is my URL. This is neat because it's all in one place. So we could go and we could check out our front end, right? So there's a web app. Our back end is not going to look that great because it's an API. So it's unless we browse into the API, but it's there. We can also look at the logs, so we can see the logs for the app, and we can see here, like we can see metrics and all kinds of stuff, debugging things. So this is amazing, right? And I did nothing to get started. So if you imagine I go through and I add in 9,000 other web APIs or other backend services, they're all right there for me to see. And this also works if I go over, and we'll be switching over to Visual Studio for more of this. So here's that same front end and back end, right? So for all of these, there's no special back end or Project Tye code. And then I could just say, so I could, in this, I could use things like Tye, down here. And actually, I lied. This is a different solution open. But this is that same idea with the front end and back end. And if I did something like Tye run, this is what I recommend doing is running these inside of the console window. Everybody's got their own console now. VS Code does, Visual Studio for Windows, Visual Studio for Mac. So that's kind of a nice way to get that integrated experience. And here you'll see it does all the things. Spins all my Dockers up and runs the stuff, and I'm able to test out and debug that in here. So that is my very quick, containerizing and getting things running experience. So instead of spending hours going through and saying like, why isn't my Docker file working and how do I hook all these different things together, I'm able to get that started very quickly. So the next thing we want to look at is debugging. And debugging microservices applications, like I was saying, is often very tricky. And the reason is because you've got to attach to processes that are actually running inside a container, and that's a whole thing, right? Fortunately, the way that Project Tye runs things is interesting. It actually, for your .NET processes, it knows how to run and expose them as a container, It does all the right container things, but when you're running locally in development, it's actually running it as a local process. So what's nice with that, let's go in here and I guess we'll set something in the back end. So we'll go, let me see, let me make sure this is, let's go into a, I don't know, let's just go into our startup and let's say we're having problems loading something, right? So we could set a breakpoint there and then we can do .NET run. Now, this is, I didn't just do, you know, hit the play button. I didn't just run my application and debug. That's because Project Tye needs to kind of orchestrate and start everything up together. Let me see, I'm in the wrong thing. I am in, let's go to one that I will know works. Let's go to front end, back end. Okay, I'm in that. There, okay. Now let's go to here, CD. Awesome, Tye run. And I know this is small type at the bottom. Don't worry, I'm just typing the words Tye run, and then a bunch of stuff is happening. So what happens here is it starts all the things up, and then once it's done that, I can actually attach to a process. So I can go in here and I can say debug, attach to process, and I could go through here and I can attach to these different, I've filtered these down. These are my .NET processes. Heck, let's attach to all of them because I don't even know what I'm doing here. And then when I go out and browse to, it's got all that happening. And I'm not sure because I think I've got more than one Tye thing running, which is neat. I probably should have stopped one of them. But then when I hit this, it'll just debug into that. So I actually, if we really want, I'm not sure. I may pull this the stop soon on this because I have a short amount of time. But if I went in and I found the actual where it's running, it'll just stop right here and debug. So I'm going to go through, I want to keep moving and show you some more complex stuff. So I'm going to stop this. I'm going to kill that one off. And we will stop this so we don't have too many ties running. Okay, great. So that's the very kind of debug experience. Now there is also a very special case that you don't have to use very often. I actually don't need to run Tye run debug just to attach to a process. This --debug gives you a thing for a very special case, which is if you need to attach to something as it's starting up. So that's if I want to go into my program or something like that at the hosting level, I want to look at configuration as it's being loaded. It actually does this really smart thing where it waits for me to attach. So that's a really kind of extra switch that you can do. Again, this is really hard to do if you're debugging a microservices app with lots of services all starting up. How do you debug when they're starting up? And this makes that very simple. So one other neat thing is being able to watch something. So let's go over to, let me see, I think this front end, back end, this is not one I want to show. I want to show a more complex one, and this is a voting application. So this voting app is pretty neat. It's got two back-end APIs. So this is an application where you would vote on whether or not you like dogs or cats. So we've got a web page here. We've got a back-end worker that receives the result, the input from the vote, and then we've got a results view that's going to handle that as well. Okay, so we need to keep these in sync. So we'll go cd voting, and we'll do Tye run, and in this case I'll say Tye run tac watch. So what's cool here is it starts the processes up using .NET Watch. And so when it's hosting all these .NET applications, it's watching for changes and just using the built-in .NET Watch capabilities where there's a file watcher on my app. So let's go over here. Where is my dashboard? I'm guessing it's at, yeah, it's at 8,000. Okay, we'll refresh it. So here you'll see, and again, this has got a lot of stuff. It's got front end, back end, but it's also got more than that. It's got a Tye YAML file. And this Tye YAML file has specified some more dependencies in here. So I've got ingress, which allows browsing into my app. It's got, so the ingress handles things calling into a multiple microservices application and handling, pointing them at the different things. Here's something even crazier. I've got Redis, and we'll talk more about that later, how cool this is, but I've actually got .NET microservices working together with Redis backend, and it's just a few lines of code to do that. So it's got Redis front end, back end. It's got Postgres as a database because why not? And that's all handled there too. So now when I go over and look at my dashboard, wow, it's all there. Okay. So the reason I spun all this up was because I wanted to show you the watch thing. So let's go over to our voting page. And here's voting, and it says dogs versus cats. Do you want dogs or cats? And then it says a little bit of information here. You can change your vote if you want to. So let's go into that page and let's see about changing something. Let's put let's do some beautiful web design. Let's put in a H2. All right, so I've done my cutting edge web design, and now let's see what's happening with that. Let's go. Oops. My oops is that I wanted to show you this, that it actually is watching for stuff and resetting them based on those changes as I update my thing, hopefully. And so now if I go over here, it didn't work. It should have done Tye run watch, and it should have actually seen my change and updated. Oh, there it is. I didn't save. Nice. So here you'll see in my debug, it says file changed, and it restarted. So it rebuilt, restarted. And now if I go over here and I refresh, there's an H2, but there it is. Hello there. All right. Not the smoothest, but you saw that it handled it for me. Just by typing Tye run watch, it's watching for changes, restarting, and this works across all the stuff. So if I had multiple different things going on, multiple APIs, et cetera, it's going to handle between them. So again, thinking about the inner loop, getting an application going with multiple services, multiple things happening, it's handling all that for me. All right, we'll go quickly here. I want to show you there's also the ability, once I've done all this stuff, I can go through and I can generate my files. So I'll go, here is an example. Sure, so I could do, in this very simple case, I could say Tye generate. And it's actually, this is going to be a very, very simple one because it's just front end, back end solution, but it's going through and it's creating my Kubernetes files for me that I would use for deployment. So, you know, very quick kind of way to get started there. So here it's got this production YAML. I'm not sure if we want to see it, but there it is. There's some beautiful YAML for us, right? So it's gone through and it's figured out. Now this is the world's simplest application with just a front end, back end, but it's seeing that stuff for us. All right. trying to fit in the combination of the getting started simple, and then I also want to show you some cool new exciting stuff towards the end. So this is the kind of more complex case at the end of my application. This is where I've developed out a more, I'm ready to go and I want to test out deployment. So there's a few things that I'll want to do with this. So here I've got a slightly more complicated front end, back end, and I've actually got a Tye YAML. Tye YAML is if I want to go in and customize things, like for instance, adding in a Redis, adding in other Docker containers, doing more complex stuff. So in order to do that, here again, I've gone back to my command line, very simple one. I'm going to type, so here all I've got is front end, back end, and hello. I can do Tye init, and it's going to create this Tye YAML file for me. So if I say cat Tye, so this is the entirety of my Tye YAML, right? So that allows me to go and do some more complex stuff. So here, switching over to my front end, back end, if I say cat Tye YAML, well, that's all we've got in this one too. It's a very simple one. So now if I did, let's try this out. I'm going to deploy. And the reason I can deploy on this machine is because I have this thing called, I've got Minikube installed. There's different ways you can do it, but I like Minikube. It's very simple. So if I type Minikube, status, great. So it's running. And Minikube actually has some really cool output. It shows all these graphical things when you're starting it up, etc. So I'll say Tye deploy -i. So I'm doing a test deployment of this application. I'm using Docker Hub as my container registry. So this is the name of my Docker Hub. And then it's using Minikube locally, and it just finds that. And it's pushing all this stuff out. So it's going to deploy this locally on my machine. There's a few other lines I need to type once this is done. And in the interest of time, I'll just kind of talk through what some of them are. I would need to actually then start using kubectl, and I need to do things like get the pods, and I need to get the services, and I need to forward some ports. And I'm not going to do that just because I don't think it's the best use of time. But if you do want to learn more about how to do that, that is in these tutorials. So if you go through these tutorials, they'll show you, there's a thing where it walks you through all the way to the end where you deploy it out. So this is going through these tutorials. At the very end, it has you do this kubectl stuff. Cool. All right. So that's deployment. The reason I talked a little bit fast is I just want a few minutes here to talk through some more advanced Tye stuff once you get going. So one of the things here is service discovery, and an important part of your applications being able to building microservices applications is for things like your front end to find your back end, and for your, if you're using Redis for whichever applications you're using those to call into Redis, or your database, etc. So we'll talk about that. The way that you can do that sort of stuff can show you in this voting sample application, for instance. So here in my startup, it's calling into, it says configuration get connection string, and we're able to, like within our worker in here, it's calling in, all of it is just using the standard configuration stuff. So .NET configuration. What's cool with, and if we look also, I think in our results, so you're not seeing any kind of complex, complicated configuration. So I think in this one, the only real config going on is here. What's neat is that we're actually using, we're using a NuGet package that's provided by Tye. And when Tye spins things up, it actually writes out environment variables named for each thing. So there's an environment variable for Redis that Tye just creates because it says, I'm spinning up Redis. Okay, there's an environment variable for the Redis connection string, and it just emits that. So we don't actually have to write that out in our app. For all of these, it's just actually creating all these environment variables. And so that makes things really easy to get started. So I can do more complex things, and we saw that like in my Tye YAML file, where if you do want to write things in, you can. But for the most part, creating like how my front end can find my back end, that's really simplified by just being able to rely on those environment variables and .NET configuration. Okay, here's just a thing I'm going to say exists. It's out on the Tye website. There's actually in the recipes area. So if we go into docs, in the docs, there's also recipes, and there's a Azure, or excuse me, not Azure, Azure Functions is also neat, but this is a cool one here where Shane Boyer wrote this up, and this is actually a deploying using GitHub Actions. So GitHub Actions runs using Docker containers, and so these things are just kind of hooked together, and this is using Project Tye to deploy your apps. So a neat thing that's available. A really cool thing is being able to use extensions. And so extensions are, like I talked about Redis, and I talked about earlier about things like tracing and logging. So let's go and hook just one of them in to my front end back end. So I'm going to go here. Let's go to front end back end. Let's stop this. Okay. And so my front end back end here is a very simple, it's a front end talking to a back end. Again, it's doing things like it's using configuration. It's just pulling from the standard configuration stuff. What I want to show though is the setting up Zipkin for doing complex tracing through the application. So in order to do that, I'm going to go into my Tye YAML. Oh, I don't know if I have time to do this. What I would do is I would go into my Tye YAML and I would actually show, or I would point at this Zipkin thing. So I'll show you how few lines of code it is to do this. So distributed tracing, and I would go in here and I would type just these lines. That's it. I would say extensions, and then I would say -Zipkin. And when I do that, it automatically spins up Zipkin. It's going to add it to my dashboard, and then I get this really cool distributed tracing view. So literally like 2 lines of code, and I've got distributed tracing hooked in. So need to wrap up. Let me just show just some final neat things here. Health checks, it integrates directly in with health checks. So there's a sample for this. It's called Liveliness and Readiness, and it's in this repo. And this is a really cool integration between .NET health checks and Redis, Docker and Kubernetes health checks. There's a VS Code extension. I'll show you a screenshot of that in a second. It's in development. It's not available yet for you to install. But it's pretty cool, and what it does is it actually just calls in through these APIs and shows them in VS Code. And then a final thing I want to talk about is DockerCompose. So this is a screenshot of what the VS Code extension looks like. Again, this is it's not available for release yet, but it is really cool. So once it's installed as a Visual Studio Code extension, and then once it's there, it automatically discovers all your stuff. And here you can see I'm clicking on Postgres and it pops up the logs for me. So just a really nice way to, inside of Visual Studio Code, I can click and see the dashboard. I can see all my things. Let me see, we talked about extensions. We talked about health checks. So the kind of final wrap up stuff, when will it be ready? So this is a more complicated answer. they say the teams is still working on it as an experiment. So if you're looking for the final, a 1.0 release, that's a .NET 6, a year from now timeframe. However, because it is a global tool and a development tool, I don't really see a good reason that you can't start using it today to develop. And what I mean by that is when you are doing your development, you're generating Kubernetes files, you're generating Docker files, and if you're able to individually or on a development team use a development tool to work more quickly, then it really doesn't affect your actual application. When you deploy your application, it doesn't need Project Tye in order to be deployed. So I feel like this is something where it's worth experimenting with locally and seeing if it fits into your development process. Okay, DockerCompose, and I'm actually going to sneak a very quick demo in using this. So it is similar to problem solved by DockerCompose. Kubernetes, excuse me, Kubernetes handles orchestration. DockerCompose also handles orchestration. A really neat thing is that they've actually written in Project Tye, they're actually starting to build in. I watched this stuff and I saw a recent check-in that said, hey, first commit of a DockerCompose parser. So if there's actually a sample in here, and if we go over to this, let's go to DockerCompose. I'll just show you what this file's like. So here, okay. So let me see, I'm switching over to, I don't know why it's not doing that. Wow. Okay, so this has a DockerCompose file. We do art dot. Well, the important thing I want to show you is that this actually is built using a DockerCompose file, and if I do Tye run, it actually goes through, parses out the DockerCompose, creates the Tye YAML stuff, and executes my application. So this is a very early beginning thing of it. If you are interested in that and you want to play more with it, I'll show you where the example is. So this is in samples and then DockerCompose. And again, the cool thing with this is that it actually is able to parse through the DockerCompose file and create the Tye YAML stuff. And I'm not going to dig into this. It solves different things, but again, the main thing to remember is this helps you get started developing locally with microservices and .NET. So definitely the what's next. I recommend the docs here. This is a great place to dig in. There's tons of stuff there. There's also a survey when you kind of complete the app. And that's it. I'm out of time. There's so much goodness here.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. So actually, Dan had a question about Dapper. Dan, what's the question?
First, I had the question about the roadmap. What's the roadmap going to be? Because I know it's experimental for the moment, but then I think you tackled it quite well. And indeed, it's no reason why we cannot use it, because it's about the development. It's not in the final product.
And I will jump in here because I think there will be a call for contributions to the project, right?
Absolutely.
I'm sure about it because this relates very much to the learning that we're promoting here. You know, because contributing to a project, involves quite a lot of learning.
Yeah, and there are already some of the docs have been contributed by community. So this is, some repos at Microsoft will involve you more than others. This is definitely one where the community is opening issues and having discussions. The team really wants to interact with developers that are building microservices. So absolutely, this is a great area to get involved.
And I've got a question not directly related to your session, but that's a question that I will stress probably forever because it's one of my questions. Selfish again. What's your approach to learning?
Oh wow.
Always the simple questions.
Yeah. People learn differently. I learn by reading code. So some people want to read a lot of docs and write things. I take a few steps. I first want to read some existing code, and then I want to build the simplest application I can. So that's part of why I love the docs here, is because they're getting started as a create a front end, back end, and just write that simple code. So that's really kind of my main approach, is trying to understand the simple things and build up, and looking at some existing code someone else has already written.
Okay. This is really helpful. I now realize that I jumped into the middle of your answer to Dan's questions regarding Dapper. Sorry,
now,
back to Dapper.
For instance, we're having another conference next week, and then we have a session from Alex Thiessen about building distributed .NET applications with Dapper. Yeah, and then Dapper and Project Tye, they seem pretty complementary.
I think complementary is a great word for it. So if on my screen here, let me show, there's actually a recipe in here for Dapper. So this is using Tye with Dapper. The two integrate together very well. So that's nice that they're not fighting. Tye, if you think about what they do, Dapper is based more on orchestration and making things kind of scaling out and working together. And Tye is more about the developer getting started and development experience. So you can easily use the two of those together, and they don't fight each other. And there've been, like you said, there've been presentations on Dapper, presentations on Tye. What's nice is there are also presentations on using Tye with Dapper. So there's some demos, including at Conf Microservices, where they dig into that. But the nice thing with it is Dapper is kind of just fits in with this. So when you're creating things using Project Tye, you can also just say, oh, and here's this Dapper thing, and it understands that and communicates with it. So, and they really do kind of solve different things. When you think of Project Tye as a developer tool for getting started and developing locally with microservices, then it doesn't compete with other things. People think, oh, how does it fit in with Service Mesh, or how does it fit in with, Orleans or like you said, Dapper? And it's really, those solve specific problems. And Project Tye, think of it more as a developer tool. So.
Right, indeed. So it's more of a development and deployment tool.
Yeah, exactly.
Is it the end of the day already?
It looks a bit that way.
Looks a bit that way. Jon, thank you so much. We're looking forward to having you in Iași or Cluj or Timișoara or whatever.
I can't wait to come back. I can't wait. Yeah, it'd be great. But it's nice to visit you from far away and pretend like I'm there.
Okay. Indeed, and who knows, if the next half a year will be also remote, let's do it again online.
I would love to. I would love to very much.
It's been a pleasure to have you at Codecamp. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jon.
And